This is part 2 of changing the brakes on an old blue Jimny. On the last episode, I jacked Jim up, balanced him on some axle stands, and got to work taking the rear brakes apart. Carried out some minor slave cylinder repairs, and then investigated a couple other seized components. The brake shoe tensioners were left for roughly 12 hours in an experimental bath of various types of cooking oil. And here we are, day 3 of changing Jim's rear brakes. The deadline is looming with less than 20 hours until Jimbo's pre-booked MOT. With my trusty old portable workbench set up, I began going about loosening the adjusters, knowing full well my feeble attempt at freeing up those parts wasn't actually going to work. Oh wait, it worked. Having proven that a squirt of Napolena olive oil works wonders for making things come free, please use responsibly, I took both adjusters apart. Shaking due to brake cleaner withdrawals, I began liberally removing any trace of cooking oil. Then I raided my toiletries bag and used my moustache brush to clean the threads. After that, I used more brake cleaner. Having dried off a solvent that pretty much evaporates on contact with the outside world, I pried open my copper grease tin, which in turn prematurely greased me. So much for the safe word. After a short, awkward silence between me and the tin, I coated the threads in grease and screwed everything back together, and made sure everything was moving freely and not binding up. Elated with how well everything was going, I greased up the nubbin that holds the brake shoe holder thing in place, and then promptly removed both of them to get some B-roll footage. With the tensioners tensioning again, I moved on to removing the handbrake plates. A simple process only made difficult when you decide to use all the wrong tools. Having removed the washer and clip without causing irreparable damage to myself, I simply reinstalled it on the new brake pad, with roughly the same amount of monkey noises it took to remove it in the first place. After a quick banana break, and by the grace of the Chernobyl gods, I grew an extra pair of hands and decided to disregard health and safety to reassemble the tensioners and the brake shoes, whilst trying to feebly pull against a very strong spring.
Right, ready? Don't hold the spring in case I let go.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Good job.
After a tricky amount of trial and error, my extra hands and I finally had everything back together. Well, sort of. Back under where the brake drums would usually be covering, I suddenly realized I wasn't seeing stars in my peripheral vision anymore. So, promptly got to work on bringing them back. Then I hooked the handbrake cable to its plate and awkwardly pushed the brake shoes around until I decided that reinstalling the brake cylinder might be a good idea. With the brake cylinder and necessary brake lines connected, and the bolts that hold everything in place having been administered some Loctite, I then pinched the brake cylinder between the two brake pads and tucked the bottom of the brake shoes behind some sort of tensioning plate, and finally hooked them together with the appropriate spring. After that, I pushed those little pins through the back plate and pads and pushed the clip back into place. Everything now firmly held in place, I hooked the tensioner's spring in place. Ever so slightly made some adjustments, and gave the outside contact points of the brake shoes a clean. After trying my hand at being an unboxing YouTuber, but ultimately deciding it wasn't for me, I gave Jimbo's drum a clean to remove the devious amounts of oil it was coated in. Now, for those of you who have stuck with the video for this long, through my nonsensical, continual, dreary droning on, what colour should I spray these new drums? Let me know in the comments below. Confident that Jim's rear brake drum wasn't going to land me a front page spot on the local newspaper, I tentatively rested it in place. Over on the flip side, everything you just saw and heard happened again, though ever so slightly faster and with a few less unga bungas. One thing I did do differently was free up the bleed valve on the crusty, seized but now unseized brake cylinder.
Cut it off. Yay.
And scraped off some of its mechanical crust. With the scraping complete, I put a dab of copper grease on the bleed valve and screwed it in place. Reinstalled the cylinder,
Yeah, boy.
and explored Jimbo's secret tunnel. Having put everything back together, more or less the way I found it, I jacked Jimbo up, replaced his wheels, removed the axle stands, and let him stand on his own two back legs. Then I tightened the handbrake by about 18 full 360-degree rotations, whilst adhering to the well-known and widely used mechanical formula of lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. In the engine bay, apparently my nostrils wanted to explore Jim's brake fluid reservoir, but after that breach of personal space, I then filled it up to the max line, before replacing the cap. With the end in sight, I flopped around on the ground until I eventually connected my DIY brake bleeding contraption, behind the scenes pending. Having poorly attached the brake bleeding contraption to the bleed valve, I then urged my assistant to start pumping the brake pedal. This then went on for some time, the urging, pumping, and flopping around on the floor like a fish, not particularly in that order every time, and various trips to the engine bay to top up the brake fluid.
Oh yeah.
Eventually, the bubbles stopped, and I was able to tighten the bleed valve and remove my contraption. All that was left to do now was hop in Jim and go for a little arse-clenching poodle around the block. Thank you for watching part 2 of changing the brakes on an old blue Jimny. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing for future content. Join me next time when I'll be attempting to change the front brakes, and stay tuned for an upcoming challenge video.
Secret tunnel.